When my billionaire ex said he would ruin me, he didn't raise his voice. He said it calmly, almost gently, like it was already done. My name is Lily, and 5 years ago, I walked away from a man who believed money was the same thing as power. His name was Shin. To the world, Shin was brilliant, young, aggressive, self-made. He built a tech infrastructure empire that quietly powered half the data centers on the East Coast. He owned private jets, appeared on magazine covers, and spoke about discipline like it was a religion. To me, he was something else. Calculated, controlling, and allergic to losing. We met when his company hired mine. At the time, I ran a mid-sized compliance and risk advisory firm. Not glamorous, not flashy, but necessary. Companies like Shin's relied on firms like mine to keep regulators satisfied and investors comfortable. Our professional relationship turned personal quickly. He admired that I didn't need his money. I admired that he didn't need approval. At least, that's what I thought. The cracks didn't appear overnight. They started with small corrections. "You don't need to negotiate that hard," he would say during meetings. "Let me handle this," he would insist, even when the contract was under my company's name. He wasn't trying to help. He was trying to position himself. By the time I realized it, the dynamic had shifted. Shin wasn't just my partner in life. He was slowly trying to become my gatekeeper in business. The breakup wasn't explosive. It was surgical. I ended it after discovering he had quietly redirected a joint venture opportunity, one that my firm sourced, into a subsidiary under his private holdings. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it. "You hesitate," he told me. "I execute." "That wasn't yours to execute," I said. He smiled slightly. "Everything becomes mine eventually." That was the moment I understood something dangerous about him. He didn't just want success. He wanted dominance. I left the relationship. Cleanly. No public drama. No interviews. No accusations. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 3 months later, 2 of my largest clients terminated their contracts simultaneously. No warning. No performance complaints. Just quiet exits. Then a third client paused renewal discussions. Then a fourth. Patterns don't lie. I began asking questions discreetly. What I discovered chilled me more than any public attack would have. Shin wasn't criticizing my firm. He was buying influence around it. Board seats. Minor equity stakes. Advisory positions in companies connected to my clients. He never spoke my name. He didn't have to. When someone with billions shifts their weight in a room, people notice. And people adjust. Within 6 months, my revenue dropped nearly 40%. Investors started asking cautious questions. Competitors began circling. Shin never called. He didn't need to. He believed silence would feel heavier than confrontation. One evening, I received a message from him for the first time since the breakup. Still standing, it read. No greeting. No context. I didn't reply. But I did something else. I stopped reacting. Instead of fighting publicly, I started digging. If Shin was leveraging influence, I needed to understand where his real vulnerability lived. Billionaires don't collapse because of emotion. They collapse because of exposure. And exposure hides in assets. Over the next few weeks, I shifted my focus entirely. I stopped trying to save the clients he had nudged away. Instead, I analyzed Shin's empire. Public filings. Subsidiary structures. Debt layering. Cross-collateral agreements. Most people think billionaires are untouchable because of their size. But size creates complexity. And complexity creates weak points. That's when I saw it. Among Shin's dozens of holdings, real estate, infrastructure contracts, technology ventures, one asset stood out. It wasn't the largest. It wasn't the most visible. But it was essential. A specialized data routing company that acted as the backbone for several of his major contracts. Without it, performance guarantees would fail. Without it, service-level agreements would trigger penalties. Without it, his empire would start to look unstable. And here was the critical detail. He didn't own it outright. He owned 49%. The remaining majority was held by early investors, quiet, aging, and based on filings, increasingly disengaged. That company wasn't just another line item. It was his pressure point. For the first time since everything began collapsing around me, I smiled. Because Shin believed he was dismantling my business piece by piece. What he didn't realize was that while he was applying pressure, I had found the one asset he couldn't afford to lose. The moment I identified the asset, I stopped thinking like someone under attack. I started thinking like someone about to make an acquisition. The company was called a routing infrastructure firm that most people had never heard of. It didn't appear in headlines. It didn't boast flashy valuation spikes. But buried inside Shin's public disclosures were cross-references that made one thing clear. His largest government and enterprise contracts relied on that routing backbone. If it failed, penalties would cascade. If control shifted, leverage shifted. Shin owned 49%, which meant he controlled it emotionally, not structurally. The majority, 51%, was split between 3 early investors who had backed the company long before it became strategically critical. They were older, quiet, absent from day-to-day operations. Disengaged investors don't look for drama. They look for exit opportunities. I didn't approach them immediately. First, I stabilized my own firm. I cut non-essential spending, consolidated teams, shifted focus to regulatory advisory services that didn't depend on Shin's network. The market saw the restructuring as discipline, not desperation. Meanwhile, I built liquidity. Not recklessly. Carefully. I brought in a private equity contact I trusted, someone who valued governance more than spectacle. I didn't mention Shin. I didn't mention revenge. I presented an opportunity. A stable infrastructure asset with predictable cash flow and hidden growth leverage. They listened. Then they asked the only question that mattered. Why is this available? Because the majority holders are aging out, I said. And the minority holder believes influence equals control. That was enough. Within weeks, I initiated quiet outreach to one of the majority investors. Not aggressive. Not urgent. Professional. The conversation was simple. You've built something essential, I said. But it's undervalued and operationally constrained. I can offer liquidity and structured growth. There was hesitation at first. Then curiosity. I didn't push. Instead, I sent numbers. Performance data. Future scaling models. Risk projections if dependency concentration increased. What I didn't say, but they understood, was this. The company was too dependent on one man. And dependency is dangerous. Over the next month, conversations deepened. One investor expressed openness to partial divestment. Another admitted he hadn't attended a board meeting in over a year. The third wanted retirement certainty. Meanwhile, Shin remained unaware. Publicly, he was expanding. Announcing partnerships. Giving interviews about resilience. Privately, he was tightening his grip on influence around my shrinking client base. He thought I was defending. I was positioning. Then it happened. One of the majority investors agreed to sell his stake, conditional on coordinated buy-in from the others. It wouldn't be cheap. But it wouldn't require billions. It required structure. My private equity contact leaned in harder. Term sheets were drafted. Due diligence began. Every step was quiet. Every move was legal. Every detail was clean. There was no manipulation. No sabotage. Just opportunity. 2 months later, I had commitments covering 51% of the routing company. Control. Not symbolic influence. Actual control. The acquisition closed on a Monday morning. The announcement was deliberately understated. New majority ownership. Strategic restructuring. Board realignment. I didn't contact Shin. I didn't need to. By Tuesday afternoon, his team began requesting emergency meetings. By Wednesday, his legal department reached out. By Thursday, he called me himself. For the first time in months. You've made a mistake, he said. No, I replied calmly. I've made an investment. You don't understand the implications. I understand them perfectly. Silence stretched across the line. That routing company wasn't just infrastructure. It was the backbone of several of his most lucrative contracts. And now I controlled the board. Which meant I controlled operational priorities. Service allocation. expansion sequencing, cost structures. Nothing illegal. Nothing malicious. But everything strategic. Why are you doing this? He finally asked. I let the question sit for a moment. You said everything becomes yours eventually, I said. I learned. He didn't respond. Because for the first time since our breakup, the leverage had shifted. And leverage doesn't need to shout. It just needs to exist. The first real crack in Shin's empire didn't show up in the news. It showed up in his contract performance metrics. The routing company I now controlled didn't sabotage him. It didn't shut him out. It didn't violate a single agreement. It simply enforced the contracts exactly as written. No priority bandwidth reallocations. No informal flexibility. No silent accommodations. For years, Shin's companies had benefited from quiet internal adjustments, favoritism masked as operational efficiency. Now, every request from his side was processed like everyone else's. By the book. Within 3 weeks, minor delays began stacking up. Nothing dramatic, but enough to trigger scrutiny from his largest enterprise client. That client requested a performance audit. The audit revealed dependency concentration. Too much of Shin's infrastructure relied on a routing backbone he no longer controlled. Investors don't panic immediately. They calculate. And when they calculated, they saw risk. Shin called me again. This time, there was no edge in his voice. You're destabilizing critical infrastructure, he said. No, I replied. I'm stabilizing governance. You're hurting yourself too. I diversified before I acquired, I said calmly. Did you? Silence. Because he hadn't. He had assumed ownership, partial ownership, was enough. He had assumed influence was permanent. He had assumed I would react emotionally, not strategically. The next domino fell quietly. One of Shin's largest pending contracts stalled renewal negotiations. The board cited structural risk concerns. Translation, uncertainty. And uncertainty in billion-dollar contracts costs more than pride. Behind the scenes, his executive team began pushing for contingency planning, alternative routing vendors, emergency partnerships. But infrastructure at that scale doesn't pivot overnight. Every alternative required time. And every month of delay triggered financial penalties. Publicly, Shin maintained composure. Privately, pressure mounted. His leverage with clients weakened. His valuation projections adjusted downward. Minor investors started questioning exposure levels. Then came the board meeting. Shin still held 49% of the routing company. He still had a seat. But he no longer had control. When the restructuring proposal was introduced, diversification of client concentration, rebalancing of service agreements, elimination of informal priority channels, he objected. You're targeting me, he said across the table. No, I replied evenly. We're de-risking the company. The vote passed. Majority rules. After the meeting, he approached me alone. You could have just fought back publicly, he said. You didn't have to go this far. I studied him for a moment. You tried to erase my firm, I said. Quietly. Strategically. Without saying my name. He didn't deny it. You thought money made you untouchable, I continued. It doesn't. Structure does. Over the next quarter, Shin's companies adjusted. They survived. Billion-dollar empires rarely collapse overnight. But they shrink. Valuations softened. Expansion slowed. His negotiating power weakened. And the routing company, now under disciplined governance, became more stable, more diversified, more valuable. Ironically, my investment appreciated. I didn't destroy him. I didn't need to. I removed his leverage. That was enough. Months later, at an industry conference, we crossed paths for the first time in public since everything unfolded. No headlines. No confrontation. Just a brief pause in a hallway filled with executives pretending not to watch. You won, he said quietly. I shook my head. No, I replied. I learned. He studied me, perhaps realizing too late what that meant. He had tried to ruin me by tightening influence around my business. I responded by acquiring the one asset he couldn't afford to lose. He thought billions meant control. He forgot that control without ownership is temporary. And ownership without foresight is fragile. He tried to ruin me. I acquired his only asset. Not out of anger. Out of understanding. And once I understood where his empire actually rested, I didn't need to raise my voice. I just shifted the foundation.